What?
Welcome back to ConCon, Consciousness Conversations. I'm DR.
And I'm Ben.
And we are we're recording at the 2023 The Science of Consciousness Conference, which I saw in an old paper, by the way, today. I was looking up some research, and I think they kept the acronym, and it used to be Toward a Science of Consciousness, and now it's called The Science of Consciousness, which I thought was interesting.
That's a bold move.
I wonder what year they decided to make that transition. So I would say, to start with, the takeaway for me today was that all the stuff we said yesterday about only go to the plenaries or only go to the keynotes proved to be kind of the opposite. We had some good plenary sessions and maybe some not so great ones. And then the concurrent sessions, which are kind of like the small papers that people presented at the end, we went to this session, it was called NCC, Neural Correlates of Consciousness, that I found really fascinating. But let's talk about the stuff in the morning first.
Well, yeah, just to give a meta-analysis.
Yeah, because I also bounced for part of the day, so Ben got way more context than me.
I think one thing about these very multidisciplinary events, I'm used to very targeted conferences. It is kind of nice to know what's out there, and then know that you don't like it, or you don't think it's fruitful for your own sort of benefit. And I think that's what happened today. I think these people in the plenary that we're about to trash were top of the line in their field, in their little philosophy bubbles, but it was not appealing to me.
Yeah. And there were multiple people today, one of the philosophy dudes, and then this guy that I actually kind of liked about the neuroelectrical fields, and he's presents at medical conferences and stuff, and he's like, man, it's a lot nicer presenting here. Things are a lot looser. Like, you can get by. you can kind of say whatever you want, and people are nod along.
That's very alien to me. But I kind of think it's cool. It seems like it's sort of that whole vibe is fostered even by the organizer in the history of the conference. So I think that's kind of cool. It's very alien to me.
Yeah,
definitely means certain of these don't appeal to me. But I don't know if I would have it any other way. I mean, obviously I'd rather have everything being mind blowing to me and beneficial.
But also it's we continue to see people from really interesting places and top flight institutions, and they're we saw multiple presenters from MIT today, people from I don't know, all over the place, any top tier institution you could imagine, any top fields, medical people, neuroscience people. It's quite an interesting mix. Yeah.
So it started with well, you want to introduce the first session? Yeah.
So this guy, Jay Singuletti, he's a University of Arizona dude, so I'm assuming he's kind of worked pretty closely with Stuart Hameroff, the organizer. And Stuart, again, hopped up at the end of his session to be like, hey, what about quantum? It's related to this stuff. But his talk was about using ultrasound to modify brain function. And so if you read a bunch of conscious literature, they make a lot of space for kind of brain lesion studies. This is really telling if you are seeing somebody with a brain lesion in a specific region and they have specific impairments. That kind of tells you what that brain region does. And there's non-invasive tools that they've had, which is, I'd heard about transcranial direct current stimulation, which there's a really entertaining This American Life episode, I think, from several years ago about people playing video games and doing this and being really smart. I ordered one. I don't know if I ever told you this. Troy and I ordered one and we were too afraid. Once we got it, we were too afraid to actually use it. But these tools are in that episode of This American Life or whatever it is. They're oh, so how many neurons is this targeting? And the researcher guy's millions, billion, all of the, it's a very blunt tool. And Singuletti sort of they're pioneering this, or I don't know if they're pioneering. I think they're refining this technique of using ultrasound waves to target. And it seems instead of this being an excitatory thing, which you would get from TDCS, and then I think there's a magnetic one too. that some friends have talked about, transcranial magnetic stimulation. But instead of getting an excitatory thing, you get an inhibitory response. And so they're able to inhibit, which actually does kind of like that lesion simulation. That was my understanding anyway.
Yeah, I was a bit confused by that, but they did show that like for certain stimulations of this transcranial ultrasound, you can like induce trippy visuals.
Yeah.
You can potentially wake up people from comas. And in fact, that referenced,
cool.
I think someone, maybe you met at a party once.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I met this guy who's a student at UCLA, and he's been working on that. I remember being kind of turned off by the fact that they were so interested in consciousness, but it was like assessing the, whether someone who's like in a vegetative state is conscious, but apparently they've succeeded in waking some people up.
And I think I made a note, even modulating emotional experience, so positive mood changes. And as you mentioned, this is sort of compared to like, I guess the traditional things, which are like not, or totally invasive brain stimulation, like the original Penfield experiments, or, digging in someone's brain in some sort. They did mention this previous work that I thought was really interesting, where if you inject current into the fusiform face area, do you remember this? They showed the guy who he's watching the doctor do this, and then the doctor's face completely changes to a different face, and he goes, "Whoa, that's a trip!" And then and when the stimulation stops, this face turns back to the normal doctor's face. To me, this is like, this experiment in some ways is the nail in the coffin for many of the sort of naive realist theories that we'll get into later. But anyway, I think this stuff is incredibly fascinating, and it's neural correlates of consciousness, but it's also like I think a direct experiment that you do something, you intervene in the brain, and there is a difference in conscious experience.
Yeah.
To me, that seems like an incredibly fruitful avenue, even though I feel like it gets a little bit downplayed by like, it's not the hard problem or something, but yeah,
I forget. Oh, I think it's in the Solms book, The Hidden Spring, where he talks about a patient who is getting this like, so they do these surgeries. If you haven't heard of this, it's pretty wild. I remember seeing it on an episode of like Grey's Anatomy, where they're doing brain surgery and the skull is actually off, and then they wake the patient up in the middle of the surgery because they need to ensure that the lesions that they're working on or whatever are being targeted. And so they like talk to them and they probe around, and they were like sort of moving things around for this woman, and she would go from states of being like totally elated to totally sad and totally depressed. And yeah, it's pretty wild. I don't know if you've ever seen this like terrible movie from many years ago with Bruce Willis called Surrogates.
No.
And basically the premise is that you have like an android version of yourself that looks like you, and it like goes to work and stuff for you, and you can just like hang out at home. But like the androids come home, and I just remember this scene really vividly, and they like have, it almost seems like a hookah kind of situation, but it's like an electric zapper, and it's like them doing drugs, and the surrogate, like the androids will like zap their brains with this thing. And it makes me wonder if, you might end up having a ultrasound thing at home to kind of like loosen up the depression or whatever at the end of a rough day.
Yeah, they did mention the default mode network, although that may have been the next talk. Do you remember?
No, it wasn't this one. Yeah, that you could target the default mode network, which is a thing that kind of gets disrupted during psychedelic use, that kind of like takes you out of the worries of your day. So yeah, I mean,
this could be a way to have a non-invasive, non-drug induced trip.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's all these ketamine exposure things, right? Imagine going in for an hour and having all of your depression alleviated, and then, sort of do some reprogramming. One of the things they did say that was interesting from the TDCS, again, this is like from a podcast from years ago, but they talked about how the effects would last for like quite a while, like days. And in this case, the effects I think they persisted for an hour, something like that. It did persist after the thing went away, but not that long.
So the next talk I have notes on is the childbirth talk, but I don't know if
that is the next talk.
That is the next talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting talk. It was basically saying we should treat childbirth as a altered consciousness experience, and that sort of, what does that entail? That means like maybe we should think about set and setting for birth, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we should not medicalize birth as much, and we should treat it as a sort of altered state of consciousness. A lot of crazy stuff was talked about in this talk, like women's their gray matter grows at some point.
Yeah.
And maybe people thought it was sort of protective in the sense that like you want to be a good young mother. And she was saying, no. Actually, it's just to protect you from surviving childbirth. Right?
Yeah.
Everything's sort of centered around childbirth. That's an interesting hypothesis, I thought.
Yeah, and it was a bit of an advocacy statement around natural childbirth versus medically assisted childbirth. Definitely. And that like a lot of the positive things go away and the negative, postpartum depression and things can increase. Some of that stuff felt a little inferential, and I was imagining, me or you trying to say that to some of our friends, female friends, about like, oh, you should, you'll, be less depressed. Like, don't get the I think it's
I did this at dinner, topic. Actually.
You did this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were super receptive. I think I think there's been a big push to do natural childbirth if possible. Definitely not planned cesarean section, which is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. Yeah. She mentioned, sort of in passing, this wasn't a part of her talk, that like I guess the rates of postpartum depression are higher if you get a cesarean section and things like that. And
it did sort of remind me of like the ayahuasca experience that people talk about, of like, oh, the anguish and the vomiting and the bodily pain is like a part of what becomes kind of emotionally transformative. Because I was thinking throughout the session, I was like, okay, you're going into this altered state of what birth is like. We know what all the hormones are and stuff that get flooded into that system. Like, could you create that? Could you, if you're in this medical situation where it's like, oh, I have to have an epidural, I have to get a cesarean section, could you kind of mimic some of those positive aspects via that chemical flooding? But I didn't think that question would go over very well. And I also didn't think it was like, I think she was kind of making the point that it was a much bigger experience than that.
It was a cool talk.
All right, you want to take over for the?
Yeah, so there was a plenary session that it turned out to be almost all philosophy.
Yeah, it was a bit of a troll as well. Like, I feel like we've had multiple sessions where they kind of lure you in with something that sounds like something that we'd be really interested in, like hallucinations. Very interesting cognitive topic, right?
Yeah, so I think they started pretty grounded, I would say, and then got more and more off the rails.
Well, that one, I don't know if that was a joke, but one of the speakers is like, I'm glad people are still clapping for these wild ideas. He's like, just so you know, they're getting crazier every single.
That we've ordered these by implausibility.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so the first one was talking about illusion versus hallucination, and here I think. My critique of philosophy is that it's just a lot of definitions. It's trying to be precise with language, which is just inherently messy, right? And I think if you want to be precise, you got to go to math. Like, to me, this is my opinion, philosophy just seems kind of like fruitless. It's like a lot of like intellectual masturbation.
Well, let me read this quote that she gave, which was so good because
the Bertrand Russell quote.
Yeah, because it felt like a bunch of mathematical proofs for the mental gymnastics, where she was like ceding points to people about like, oh yeah, it is about naive realism. I'll let Ben talk about that, but well, actually, maybe we need to define naive realism before I say this quote, so it makes more sense.
Well, okay. Let's say that the first talk was illusion versus hallucination, and then sort of like, drilling down on these concepts and saying there's actually some subtleties here
I forgot about the first
with
talk.
That definition. Let's add a column. Yeah. Let's add a row to this table, and then you get some kind of interesting things. You say, oh yeah, like okay, if we fill in this table, like I guess the definition was kind of incomplete. It wasn't very rigorous. I think this is the goal of philosophy. Good philosophy sort of rigorizes language to the point where you see that there's other possibilities you hadn't accounted for because you had sort of entangled definitions. You disentangle the definitions and you say, oh, there's a whole space of things that haven't been talked about yet.
But I think most people listening to this podcast even / generally most people would look at that table and roll their eyes at like, you know, is trying to dissect the difference between illusion and hallucination and saying like, oh, if you're attributing false properties to an item that does exist, that's different than perceiving an item that exists and you know, like that doesn't exist and attributing true properties to it. Like, no, it's just you're seeing something that's not there. Like I don't like the nuance there was not super interesting, which is where I thought it was going to go in this whole session. It was like, oh, tell us why someone would hallucinate in this way versus that way, and that's not where they went. It was just definitions.
Yeah. But then they only got worse after that. And there's this thing that until today I didn't know what it was. Naive realism. Maybe Bertrand Russell said it best. Maybe that's how we can define it.
Yeah. So, naive realism, I said after she explained it, I was like, oh, this is just like a normal dude. Like naive realism is like a normal person seeing like a lamp and being like, oh, that must be a lamp. But to like our point from earlier about the emotional thing, like we are our perceptions and our assumptions much more than we are like than our perception is reality. So this is what Bertrand Russell said. We all start from naive realism, i.e. the doctrine that things are as they seem. Oh, I guess he does define it. We think that grass is green, that stones are hard, that snow is cold. Naive realism leads to physics, and physics, if true, shows that naive realism is false. Therefore, naive realism is, if true, is false. Therefore, it is false.
So good. It makes me want to read that book. That's from like, what, 1942 or something?
Yeah, I read, he does like a history of philosophy, like a survey of like all Western philosophy. That's pretty good. I read it a few years ago.
Yeah, basically, these people are like the anti-Anil Seth. Anil Seth is like your entire lived experience is a controlled hallucination. Like you have a mental model, right? And that's basically you're living inside your own brain. And the naive realists say, no, when the grass is green, like that's actually a property out in the world that the grass has. It's an objective reality out there outside of your mind. And to do that, you basically have to discount pretty much all we know about physics. But there's incredible mental gymnastics you can do to sort of, keep up the game longer and longer, right? And we saw that basically. So, people got up there and said a lot of things about ideal realism, and I feel like these people just must love arguing. Like if you go into philosophy and then you pick something like ideal realism, or I keep saying ideal, naive realism, you just must love being contrary, right?
Yeah.
And after each of these sessions, there would be a huge queue of people with really good objections. I was flabbergasted. There was this guy from MIT. We've heard of MIT. These aren't people from these are like the top of the top of the crop. He gives the whole talk about naive realism, and then one of the questions they're like, oh, this guy, you could tell he's like, I got a zinger, I'm gonna stump you. And he's like, what if I eat the banana, the green banana? And the guy basically throws up his hands. I don't know if I told you this because I think you had bounced by that point. He goes, well, just to be clear, I'm not a naive realist. And I'm thinking, what? You jerk? You spent this whole hour defending this thing that you don't even believe in. And you called it, by the way. You called it. Not that guy, but the one before it. You went, does this person even believe this? Yeah. Or are they just arguing?
It's debate club. And they're looking for like semantically defensible positions. And that's it. And it's like, but what do you think? And I would say the general credit of most people at this conference, you get a lot of spicy takes that are totally unsubstantiated from people show their cards a lot, which I think is pretty cool. So you'll be I'm a brain researcher and I've got this like really tiny pocket of stuff that I'm interested in, and I show this one small thing, but here's what I really think about consciousness, and they'll just like drop that at the end of the session. I actually really appreciate that, and I think in part it's because you don't have people ready to pounce, right? Like everybody kept saying.
Yeah, I think it seems like everybody has much more patience than I do. So maybe I need to change. Maybe I'm the problem here.
I think we have limited time, and we gotta give our energy to the stuff that. I mean, I have a hard time imagining almost anyone that I know being able to sit through those. I mean, you're a saint for having made it through all those sessions, but.
Yeah, so just to recap though, like when you really dig into this this concept, you basically, and these people would say it, they're anti-emergence, they believe in top-down causality, they're anti-hallucination, and they're anti-representation. They don't think that there's a representation in your head of the banana that you're seeing. They think that there's sort of an interaction identity between you and the banana, and there's no representation. You're seeing it as it actually is.
Yeah, so to come full circle on them being trolls, like to be clear, this was a session about hallucinations where they were arguing that there are no hallucinations, which I guess is fair.
This is true. Yeah, I mean, one of the people, and they're all kind of funny, by the way. I think you have to have a sense of humor when you go into something like this. So, she was sort of saying, like, one clear argument against this is the brain in the vat problem. A brain in a vat being fed the exact right sort of percepts that it does not know it's a brain in a vat. It thinks it's a brain in a body, doing a podcast right now. Like, how do you defend against that with this sort of naive realism? Well, you basically say brain in a vat's impossible, and here's why, X, Y, Z. But I did like how brain in a vat comes up so much in this branch of philosophy that they just call it BIV, for short. BIV. Oh yeah, the BIV. Yeah, we're going to tackle that later.
And Ben did query Midjourney for some great brain and vat art during the session. All right, let's talk about this Giovanni Marsicano character. This might be a bold statement, but I think this is my favorite talk of the whole thing so far. Not maybe like the whole presentation, but the novelty, like this one novel idea I thought was really impressive and powerful. And also he sort of like put his cards down and was like, I think to me a big part of consciousness is story. And the story that you're kind of narrating in your head about yourself and about your world. And so he started off talking about Pavlov and classic conditioning. And it's like, oh, you're having this strong signal, which is like you need to eat something, or you're hungry, and you have the bell, and you're kind of wiring these things together. And he said, this is actually not how most knowledge and storytelling works. What happens is you have a bunch of really weak signals, and then those weak signals get kind of like pooled together over time. And they had some really cool rat studies that they did where they were kind of like trying to kind of program, like associate smell and taste and water and nausea. I'm doing a bad job of explaining it, but they were kind of trying to tease out whether rats were kind of like creating this narration. And he had
they're basically saying like there's like a story you can create that is powerful, that sort of can link together very sort of weak stimuli.
Yeah, that might be valuable in the future. So he's saying like, in the classic conditioning case, the bell and the food are present, like it is clear this association. And so the example he gave was you're seeing a broken twig and you're seeing a rabbit running away. And it's like, that could mean nothing, but that could mean that there's a big animal like a bear that's nearby. And if you're able to imagine that story of the bear, you're probably more likely to survive. You're kind of the low-level equivalent of, detective, right? And he talked about kind of detective stories, and like that's kind of like part of what the human narrative is. And you could really think of, apes to humans, to higher level culture as kind of like escalating complexity in these narratives that we're able to put together through low-level signaling.
But I thought the really cool thing was that he did some hard neuroscience, and he said it appears to be, at least from his experiments, that some of this storytelling ability comes from our endocannabinoid receptor sites.
Yeah, and then he talked about using THC in these studies as a way of basically increasing the storytelling capacity.
Or even I think they did like a lesion study with like rats, right, where they just like didn't let the CB1 receptor operate.
Oh yeah, that's right. And then he was kind of extrapolating again at the end a little bit loosely. I'd be interested to follow him and see kind of where these papers go. But they were kind of saying like, ketamine, other psychedelics may have this property as well, where it's like actually facilitating more environmental kind of storytelling, like being able to pull together small bits from the environment.
Yeah, like sort of small stimuli and connecting them. And he sort of made the point that you can take it until it's pathological, until you don't want to associate every sort of small stimulus, because there won't be it won't be an interesting story to tell that's evolutionary advantageous. You'll just become like delusional.
Yeah.
Which I thought was like a pretty profound.
Well, it's a really simple explanation of why, it's like, you're like, hard problem, like why should you need to have phenomenal experience at all? Well, whatever that confabulator is, the storyteller that's kind of putting those clues together in a conditioning mindset, needs to be more complex than the frog, right? The frog is reacting in all those different contexts, grabbing the flies or whatever, but the monkey is going to like need to have all this visual data that's getting pulled up into that confabulator to process and be like, oh wait, there was this and there was this and there was this. There's no way a frog could do that.
By the way, I don't know if you mentioned, but this whole session was a small session. It was one of the parallel sessions, and it was called NCC, Neural Correlates of Consciousness, which is, I feel like, almost a pejorative term used by like David Chalmers, because that's the easy problem, right?
Yeah.
However, this stuff was mega juicy. I loved this session much more than the philosophy plenary session, which was the reverse from yesterday.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to talk about all of the ones from this. The one that I did really like was the Propofol anesthesia one. I thought that was super cool.
Yeah.
So this is another MIT guy, right?
Yeah, he's from MIT. Yeah. I really wish he
Adam
had like double the time.
Yeah.
He did an admirable job of packing in a lot of
he's definitely going to be
groundwork.
Back if this kind of research was really impressive. The coolest graph and kind of concept that he came up with was, they were talking about like what happens when you're taking propofol. So propofol is like a classic anesthetic they use in when you're having surgery. And so he talked about the difference between dynamic stability and dynamic instability. So dynamic stability is sort of like a pendulum. So a pendulum is in motion, but if you know a few things about the pendulum, you know exactly where it's going and where it's going to come back to, versus, like some chaotic system, like a babbling brook or a stream where it's sort of things are going in all directions. And he showed this graph of what was it? Was it like was it EKG or EEG? I don't remember what the input was, but he showed these graphs of kind of what was happening.
It was actually like a brain probe. Like it was like 256 channel.
Yeah. So it was brain probes. It was actually intracranial brain probes on primates, like monkeys. And so they could track kind of neuronal activity. And what happened is when they're on propofol, a thought would essentially go out. It's like, hey, let's go find some friends. And your brain activity was so slow that it just like never found anyone, and it would just stop.
Yeah, he did this really. I mean, so it's a high dimensional thing, right? He's not only has like many channels, but then he's sort of stacking in time, right? Because he's looking at the dynamics. But when you use like sort of a dimensionality reduction technique, and you graph it in 2D, you get these wonderful sort of like non-anesthetic, anesthetic things where like you hear a tone, and there's sort of like this like loop that always comes back to itself when you're in normal, like non-anesthetic mode. And then when you're in anesthetic mode, you hear the tone, and it's sort of this loop that goes and just kind of unravels and it never comes back, right? It's dynamically unstable. It was really beautiful. I mean, dimensionality reduction is kind of, it's a little bit risky because you can sort of, there's a lot of human interpretation that goes along. But I thought it was such a beautiful sort of visual to like what seems to be happening, when your sort of mind unravels in the anesthetic state. But his main point was sort of showing that there was, I guess, a debate on how anesthetics work. Do they sort of lock you into this super rigid, resonant state where you just can't get out of this very like basic sort of just awareness consciousness or non-awareness consciousness or something like that? Or is it that it unravels everything, right? And then none of the pieces of your brain, they're totally fragmented, they can't speak to each other. And so is it this dissonance or this sort of like resonance kind of thing? And different literature, I guess, says different things. And so his model and his sort of dynamic differential equation sort of stuff, I think showed pretty convincingly to me, at least from what I know about these kind of techniques, that it was an unraveling.
Yeah,
right?
The instability.
Yeah.
Well, I would say the only other one that I would kind of talk about from that session was the mind blanking.
Okay, so
we were so tired by the end. It's like
I asked my partner about this because so mind blanking is sort of they kind of defined it as when you sort of blip out of existence and you're like, oh, how much time has passed? What was it? And then if someone would be like, what were you thinking about just then? You'd be like, nothing. And I feel like this maybe happened to me twice. And I said this, and Charlotte, my partner.
Wait, it's only ever happened twice in your life?
I think so. It's like very rare. And Charlotte was like, oh, that happens to me every day. And the other people at dinner were like, "Oh yeah, that happens to me all the time." And like,
well, so this happened 2 days ago when we were doing the podcast, and I had multiple moments where I was like in the middle of saying something, and I just like ran out of gas, and so like this was super interesting to me because I was like, yeah, I just experienced this, and our by the way our rationale for this is that it was CO2 content in the room. So we now have a CO2.
By the way, I mean, Mount Etna erupted. I actually wonder if the baseline CO2 is a little bit higher because the air quality and all that. I don't know if that disambiguates like CO2 and other particulates.
We've gone up quite a bit since the start of this recording.
But anyway, yeah, so mind blanking is sort of when you blip out of existence and you're not thinking about anything. And it basically, it was really interesting, and the questions kind of went on like well past the sort of time limit, but I was enjoying it because I think there's a lot of thorny questions. Like, how do you even test for this? Like, if it's self-report and you're saying, okay, sit there and try to figure out when you have a mind blank event, like and then when you think you do, hit the button. Yeah. There's like that lights up a very particular circuit of the brain. And they were criticizing this, so there was sort of a response to this, and they said, well, actually, what we should do is indirect, where I think the task was something really monotonous, like you have to hit a button every 2 minutes on the dot for an hour, and then eventually someone's going to space out, and then you go, hey, why didn't you hit the button? The timer, and they go, oh, I guess I blanked out, and then you record that. I think that was sort of the gist of it, and you get totally different brain activity for that. It looks more like a microsleep, right? Versus the other one where it just looks like sort of a deadening of your inner voice, which was still interesting.
Yeah, the microsleep I thought was really fascinating because he was sort of saying like, and this really resonated with my experience from the other night, which was like we were super tired. We like had that whole like horrible travel day, and he was saying like your NREM sleep, which is like your not dreaming sleep, like your brain is kind of like, I don't know, in repair or memory reconciliation. I don't know exactly what all the bits are of NREM, but like that felt very resonant. It's like, oh yeah, my parts of my brain are just trying to sleep. It's like it's time.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that kind of wraps up the day. We had a lot of strong statements, I think, last time that we should always go to the plenaries, and then the parallel sessions were skippable. But we experienced the reverse this time.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about the poster session, but maybe we'll go to the next one and we can talk about them both together.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks guys for joining us for episode 5, I think.
Episode 5, but... from Terramina, this
number 3.
Number 3.
Yep.
Yeah.
We'll see you next time. Learn more about us at ConCon.show.
Come see us, Terramina.
Yeah, come see us at Terramina.
Beautiful town.
What?